Welcome back to the FECast, your weekly dose of economic thinking from your friends at the Foundation for Economic Education. We are here in full force this week with our regular panel after taking
back in town.
Yes.
taking a little bit of time off. We've got Anna Jane Perrell, Dan Sanchez, and Marianne March. And Dan is bearded.
We have a new guest, Dan's beard.
Yes.
Very exciting.
Not much of one.
Very
We expect that it will grow very full in the week and days to come.
It'll be our new mascot.
Yeah, we should start tracking it. Like, we'll do a quick segment.
Beard
on
watch.
Yeah, Beard Watch. Exactly. Wonderful.
Have a ticker going along the
I
bottom.
love it.
Well, so this week, I wanted to start by asking you a question, and that is, are you finding it more difficult than usual to talk to people these days about things that are happening?
That is an
People are on edge.
understatement. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I tend to be kind of radio silent on my own personal social media just because I don't want to go there. I don't want to lose friends. It's tough to navigate that. And if I have a thought that I want to share, I think twice because I don't want to have to deal with lengthy and time-consuming repercussions.
That's dangerous too, right? I mean, when you look at the image that sometimes appears on Facebook of the guy who it's labeled sharing your opinion in 2018 is like this, and he gets shot immediately with like 100 arrows.
Yeah, but even your technique isn't foolproof because even silence is interpreted as taking a side. It's
true.
Yeah.
Because like Taylor Swift, for a while until recently, she was very silent on the issue.
Dan with the Taylor Swift references. Oh, wow. Okay. He's been on TMZ lately.
I think she's a good singer and musician. Yeah,
Really? Me too.
And do you respect her political opinions?
Should you?
I respect them. Like I don't necessarily agree with them, but even when she was silent about them, people interpreted that as like, you can't be silent in the age of Trump. That's complicity with Trump.
Tacit approval.
Yeah.
Especially being a pretty wealthy person. I think we all just kind of assume, unless otherwise said, if you've got money to spare, you're probably leaning right. Or at least that's what I assume.
And of course, the person who interrupted her during the awards ceremony a few years ago, Kanye West, has been, shall we say, outspoken in support of Trump.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. He wears that. He wears the hat, the iconic hat. Every day. Apparently, I was listening to an interview with one of the SNL writers, and he appeared 2 weeks ago and said that every single day of that week he showed up in the hat and posted about it, and actually gave a speech that they cut out at the end of the taping of Saturday Night Live. Yeah, he's definitely out there making statements for sure.
And so, why are we finding it more difficult today to talk with people? Is it a culture of sort of sharing our ideas and just criticism? If you say something, then you're automatically opening yourself up to criticizing or being criticized?
Well, I think I think saying, why are we not talking with people is giving us too much credit at this point even, because it's not a conversation anymore. It isn't. And I think that's the difference that we're seeing is that a true discussion is, I hear your side, here's my answer to your side,
right,
and kind of assessing and mirroring back the observations of the person. I mean, that's a basic conversation, right? But I don't think that we're doing that anymore. I don't think that we're even trying to understand the point of view of the person that we're speaking with. And I mean that in a very general sense. I mean that in most interactions that are at all in any way political. Yeah. If you're not talking about puppies or cats, like you're,
Yeah, I think people don't think they need to understand. I think they assume that they already do understand. They hear certain terminology or language that they identify with being, let's say you're on the left and you hear somebody use language that sounds like they're conservative. Then, oh, well, I already know what you think about immigration. I know what you think about equal pay and any number of different kinds of policies, and we don't feel the need to even listen to what people have to say because, well, I know what you think.
Yeah, all it takes are certain words, and the words are just instant signals.
They're triggers.
Instant triggers, exactly. That Taylor Swift didn't have to say very much in her recent awards acceptance and a tweet after she endorsed some Democrats. But just using the words LGBTQ and systemic racism, just by uttering those words, like just signals volumes to so many people. And no nuances conveyed at all.
Yeah, she popped the systemic. That's a big, that's a word.
And then beyond just using that kind of language, she specifically advocated for the Democratic Senate candidate in Tennessee.
Well, and so, all these troubles that we're having communicating these days with various virtue signal triggers, various other things, it reminds me of an article we had recently on fee.org by our managing editor, John Miltimore, where he talks about the framework that one of the leading sort of thinkers in this area has been using for a long time, Jonathan Haidt, who has written several books, including one called The Righteous Mind, where he outlines your moral taste buds that he says each person is actually born with to various degrees. And we're not built, or born rather, with sort of this blank slate where, you kind of learn what values are important or useful to you, but you begin to build off of what you've had from sort of your inception as a person.
Yeah, and he says that the alternative to a blank slate is not like a rigid, fixed, eternally immutable moral content that you just have regardless. The analogy he uses is that you're born with a first draft, like a moral first draft. And as you go through life, that first draft of your morality can be edited and revised extensively, but it's definitely not a blank slate at the beginning.
He said, Jonathan Haidt said an interesting quote that I liked about this idea of a moral matrix, and that if you accuse the other side of just being blind and that excuses all of their actions, then you are in the moral matrix.
Wait, what do you mean?
It would be tough for me to define what
is the moral matrix.
So we're actually reading The Righteous Mind at our book club at Fee. So I'm at the beginning, in the first chapter, you might say, but
I'm a little behind.
Yeah, but
it's sort of like being like in your own ideological bubble and not being able to see other people as being at all well-intentioned, and sort of like people in the matrix, and until they take what's the pill that wakes you up?
The red pill.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah.
You could take the blue pill and remain sort of in your own matrix of preferring, for example, care over harm. Well, most of us do, right? But if you take the red pill, then you begin to think a little bit more about where other people are coming from.
Oh, okay, so people sometimes call it like the echo chamber, right? Or like your
silo.
Your
bubble.
Yeah, your bubble, your silo of information. I think it's interesting that you say this ability, we really should foster this ability to understand where other people are coming from. This is really lame, but I used to do community theater when I was, little. And as a motivation for understanding like the villain in these plays that we would do, they would say, you have to believe that this person's in the right. And that's how you do that character well. And to take my community theater acting skills, I think I like to apply that to discussions with people and debates with people, is that to make this an effective discussion, you have to believe, or at least try to understand, that they think they're in the right.
So you're applying a kind of moral matrix method to your thinking around this sort of stuff.
Maybe.
Let's talk about method acting.
Yeah.
Well, and his big point about the moral taste buds is that it is similar to a sensation, similar to a raw sensation, as opposed to the way we normally think of morality as an act of reasoning. And so we find that we get so frustrated trying to reason with each other, especially across the ideological divide, and it's almost like we're speaking different languages. And part of that is because, as Jonathan Haidt argues, that when we make moral judgments, it's very much an intuition. That when we're responding to someone making an argument, we're not trying to judge, okay, are they right? Am I right? Let me try to figure this out. They already have their conclusion already built in, and then they try to spin an argument to justify that preordained conclusion.
It's almost as if you have that particular gene that makes you hate cilantro, right? You take a taste of some very cilantro-heavy salsa, and you immediately have this reaction. It tastes like palm olive, right? And you don't want to eat it anymore. So if you're on this sort of, you're thinking more maybe progressive, the way that Jonathan Haidt might say, you are very high on the care versus harm, the care side of that spectrum, right? So basically, if there's something that smacks to you as being harmful to the least advantaged in a society, you'll spit it out. And you'll spit out your own example of why they're wrong in advocating a particular policy or idea. To bring it back to economics, right? Say you are having an argument or conversation, I hope, with a friend of yours on the minimum wage, on the notion that maybe the minimum wage could be raised to $15 an hour, to be a living wage, the way that Bernie Sanders and other people think about it. You would have this immediate reaction against someone saying, if you're thinking economically and saying, well, if you raise the price of something, it's actually going to make it more prohibitive to actually hire somebody. You would have this reaction against higher minimum wage because you say, no, that's not the way it works. It doesn't work that way. But on the other side, if they were to be, talked to by you about not wanting a minimum wage, you would say no. You know what I mean?
Well, basically, you're saying that like the spitting out of the cilantro is you're spitting out the other person's idea without even kind of considering.
You don't even think about it.
Or like cinnamon rolls.
Oh yeah. Dan and I were discussing how
this
I
morning?
hate cinnamon rolls. Did you bring those in?
I did.
Okay, well, we need to.
You
talk.
hate cinnamon rolls?
Look, here's the thing.
They're
Coffee and cinnamon
Nope.
are two of the foundational kinds of foods or spices, whatever you want to call them, of the modern world. Why don't we use them together? And yet you hate them. You spit that out.
Right.
I think it's
and so no
too
matter how
decadent.
much we argue that you're inherently
That
wrong
is true.
for X, Y, and Z, it's like, well,
I just know.
you're
I
gonna
just
be able
know
to-
it's
right.
gross.
And you're
Yeah,
gonna
like
be-
no, you're wrong. But I guess my question is, if you're saying so, if Haidt is saying that you are born with some sort of moral imprint that is a first draft of sorts, if I'm understanding that thesis correctly, but then cilantro is your distaste for cilantro is genetic. So are we saying that you're born with a specific imprint and you just can't really change it, or is it at our best we can change?
Well, we can have acquired tastes. So you can develop maybe cilantro if it genetically just tastes really awful, then you can't acquire that taste. But there are other tastes that you can acquire.
It's
and
more like
similarly,
coffee.
similarly, the moral first draft that we have can evolve, and people can change even from one ideological camp to another.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan Haidt suggests that there are 5 different spectra of moral taste buds that you might have. And imagine 5 different lines with, for example, care on one side and harm on the other. And if you're progressive, you score really high on the care side of things, at least according to his analysis. Some other of the taste buds include fairness on one side and reciprocity on the other, right? So progressives, again, might score very highly on the fairness side. Another one that particularly is interesting for what he calls the conservatives are loyalty on one side and betrayal on the other, right? And so loyalty for conservatives, as he describes them, is a very extreme or very keenly felt kind of moral taste bud. So you want to be loyal to the institutions that created a civil society as we now have it, right?
Yes. And then John Miltimore points out that in his article that conservatives and liberals really emphasize care and harm and fairness versus reciprocity in their own ways, whereas liberals, the loyalty betrayal aspect, they kind of downplay that. And they also downplay authority versus subversion and sanctity versus degradation, whereas conservatives give more emphasis to those 3.
And so we were talking a little bit earlier about living in the matrix, right? So not breaking out of the system that you get all the time by your own thinking, by your friends' thinking, by your Facebook feed that's typically oriented toward your own sort of moral taste buds these days. What are some more examples of how we've kind of developed this living in the matrix tribal type of thinking? I can think of, obviously, the Kanye West example we talked about before, Taylor Swift, we discussed a little bit, but there's more.
The Kanye one is even more interesting than we've discussed because he has this really controversial aspect of his tweet where he talks about the 13th Amendment.
Oh yeah, you're talking about this. So this is like right after the Saturday Night Live thing. They block him. They make sure his message isn't heard. That is kind of annoying in and of itself to me. But then he goes on Twitter and he posts a photo of the hat and he says something about abolishing the 13th Amendment. And I mean, immediate. You're talking about really, really charged imagery as well as saying something like abolishing the 13th Amendment is insane. I mean, it sounds crazy, right?
13th Amendment, of course, is the amendment that officially outlawed slavery
Yes.
at the federal level following or right before, in fact, the Civil War.
Yeah. And then but then you come on to discover when you actually look, when you read the entire tweet and then you actually think about if you say, okay, I'm going to remove, for lack of a better word, I'm going to remove my bias about who he is and how crazy he's acting and what he's already said he cares about and just try to understand his tweet. We see that he's actually identifying, it's a comment on prison reform.
Right, because in one way, it abolished slavery, but one activist pointed out that it also wrote slavery into the Constitution because it explicitly allowed for prison slavery, basically.
Yes, and that's a common argument against the 13th Amendment.
I've got the actual language of the 13th Amendment, which states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So
Kanye's I think he's really trying to address like people who are wrongly convicted and put in jail, and then you know, that being a new form of slavery is kind of the comment that he's making, which is a really big comment.
It is being called the new Jim Crow, and I think that Kanye is tapped into that, which a lot of people don't address.
Which is a meaningful message. And so it's like we take this, and I remember even my friends freaking out. They're like, God, he's being such a psycho. Like, can you even believe that he
So
tweeted
that he
this?
wants to reinstitute slavery is basically what people end up reading into that, right?
Well, he used language saying abolish the 13th Amendment. And so people, I think in some ways rightly, were like, whoa, we're not abolishing the amendment that outlawed slavery, without the finer point that he later clarified that he is specifically speaking to the aspects that allow us to take rights away from people who are in prisons.
Well, this is where I get frustrated, because even in the first tweet, I analyzed, this is like something I was like paying attention to live time. Even in the first tweet, he identifies, he mentions prisoners in his first tweet. And so that's where I go back, and he does clarify later, but it's evident from his first tweet. If you remove kind of these glasses that we wear that are so informed by partisanship or social media, you realize that maybe he is actually trying to make a comment, which is really cool.
Well, and it really is the partisanship, because again, it's the moral taste buds, and the red hat already, gave a flavor to people with certain moral taste buds that just predisposed them against anything he had to say. And so that put a filter where they interpreted 13th Amendment, it must be pro-slavery because he's on the side of Trump. And it didn't matter what the actual intention was.
Well, they almost they're like, to them, it's like, he wants to abolish the 13th Amendment. That's more proof he's insane when they aren't listening to the reasoning, which is, I think, important.
And I'll clarify real quick. I said it was passed before the Civil War. Yes. It was actually passed from the Senate in 1864 and passed the House in 65, and it got ratified in 1865. So not quite accurate there, but it was the amendment that blocked slavery from being instituted, except in this case that I think Kanye is making a very good point about, unless you were duly convicted of a crime. And in that case, slavery is okay. But no one ever wanted to really look into the context behind that, because I guess context is for kings these days. We just want to argue with each other.
Whereas that context wouldn't have been missed, or probably wasn't missed, in other cases where other rappers have brought up the 13th Amendment and how it legalized slavery in prisons. And I'm sure they didn't get denounced because they didn't have a red hat on.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the important thing for society is that if we want to have a deeper understanding, we can't leave these people out. We're not going to have a really deep understanding if we only include conservatives, or if we only include progressives, or even if we only include libertarians. We're going to be missing pieces of the pie. There's that dispersed knowledge that we're not going to have.
Yeah, another interesting aspect of this is the incivility that is so prevalent. And we have another article, 5 possible reasons incivility and outrage are on the rise. And one of them is technological advances, that maybe it's the anonymity that Twitter and other social media platforms give people, that when you're anonymous, it's sort of like in Socrates, Plato's the ring of Gyges that makes you invisible and gives you impunity, and like, are you going to act morally and be responsible and civil if you have that kind of anonymity? And maybe what do you think? What do you guys think of that?
It doesn't appear like it.
Yeah,
does it? Well, even when you're not anonymous, there are other news stories happening over the past couple of weeks in regard to actions that have been taken in Congress, such as Brett Kavanaugh being approved by the Senate, right? I mean, Jeff Flake was accosted by some people on camera.
Oh my God, I've been following that. So I was listening to some interviews with Jeff Flake before. So this reporter followed Jeff Flake before.
And of course, he's the senator. He's a senator from Arizona who was on the Judiciary Committee.
Exactly, and he was really celebrated. So he's a Republican, and he was celebrated by self-identified Democrats. He was heralded because he said, "I will not vote until we get an investigation," and that was like famous. That was really important because it showed bipartisanship, which I think that that's how people took it. They're like, it's bipartisanship. He is celebrating democratic values. As a Republican, this is great. But listening to these really interesting interviews with him, he's saying, it frustrates me that this is considered bipartisanship when it's really just respect for the system. He's like, I want this committee to run. He's like, he called it a food fight. He was like, it was a food fight from day one. And I wanted this to be a process that was adhered to correctly and with respect and like respect for the institution. And it was an interesting observation that he was like, that's important to me, is that we respect the process. And that's why I called for an investigation, because I didn't want it to be just a partisan bloodbath.
Ramming it through and without any kind of due process, even though it wasn't a
Exactly.
trial.
Yeah.
So it seems like we're kind of in this food fight all the time now, right? I mean, there's no stopping it, right? We fling insults at each other, and sometimes the very words we use are the insults that people take umbrage with. So how do we break out of this sort of constant flinging of our own sort of ill-conceived or maybe unsympathetic opinions to other people?
I think part of it is shrinking the role of government in society, because there's so much on the line that to some degree it makes sense that people would get so angry when the power of government is intruding in so many different aspects of your life. It's like you're either in control of this horrible apparatus or you're a victim of it.
I think you're absolutely right. We're risking so much. We give so much authority to government to dictate our lives and like big parts of our lives, and maybe that's why it's so polarizing to talk about politics.
So why don't we just elect better people? Why don't we just pick more benevolent people who, once they get that power, aren't going to be a-holes with it?
Yeah,
to quote,
that's Hillary Clinton's answer. She was asked about incivility, and she said that really the problem is that you can't be civil with the Republicans. Basically, like we'll have civility again once Democrats are back in power.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how it works. Wait, so is it Mises who said, "Where do we find these angels?" That quote.
Milton Friedman.
No, Milton Friedman. Yeah, sorry. So sorry. Yes, he said, "Where do you imagine we find these angels that will
that'll run good government without being self-interested, right?" Well, so at FEE, and I think all those answers are great. Of course, we believe that to our core at FEE. One of the things that we've undertaken in recent years is to begin actually listening to people a little bit more intentionally when it comes to communicating the ideas of free market economics, strong ethical principles that underpin a free society, the rule of law, various other things that we discussed on this show that FEE stands for. And so we've kind of looked at various of these different sort of ways to analyze how to talk to people, but then also to understand where they're coming from, right? So we've thought about Jonathan Haidt and his moral foundations, the moral taste buds that we talked about. We also look at a couple other things at FEE, one of which is called the three-axis model, the three languages of politics. It's by a person affiliated with the Cato Institute called Arnold Kling. And so we've looked at sort of how progressives sort of talk in terms of the oppressor versus the oppressed. Libertarians most often in our office, we've experienced this ourselves, talk about liberty versus tyranny or coercion. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, so you're saying understand the language of the people that are not like you.
Right. Understand how to talk with people who aren't like us. And the first thing is to begin to actually listen, or at least have some empathy for the fact that they're coming from a position, a whole life experience that may be very different from your own. And whatever sort of slate of values or moral taste buds they were born with, that's the context through which they begin to see the world. And that's not to say that that can't be edited or improved upon or acquired by taste.
But in fact, that should motivate our work more, is that you can edit or update or refresh someone's taste or their moral blueprint or their first draft. I think that that's actually one of the reasons that I am so drawn to specifically, the values that FEE celebrates and the things that we talk about and explore, because it's that belief that we are all uniquely complex individuals with our own sets of values that are equally important, right? And so to imagine that there is going to be some sort of authoritarian entity that can reinforce not only my values, but your values, your values, your values, it makes my mind hurt. And so I think that is why the ultimate answer for me is to, let's just limit the authority of a specific entity over our lives and think about how individually we can act on our values.
Yeah.
And then through those interactions, through continual voluntary interaction, we learn more about other people's values, and we can change or improve.
Yeah. I think that's completely reasonable. But I do think that, to take it more personally for myself, is that I maybe just need to eat a little bit of humble pie now and then and admit that I don't know everything. I don't know what the person sitting across from me is thinking or why they feel the way they feel, and taking the time to listen, as you said, and get past my own desire to make things simple, because reality is complex and the way people's minds work is complex, and we don't know everything.
Yes.
Or your own
absolutely.
desire, speaking from my own perspective and talking with people about things, to be right about it.
Yeah.
You will not be right all the time. And to force that upon somebody is a grievous mistake.
Yeah.
And
Unproductive.
it's unproductive,
Yeah.
and it'll push them away from you.
To imagine, to walk into a conversation hoping you're going to learn as much as you hope to teach someone is I think the best way to think about things. Fee is specifically one of our values, is intellectual humility. We talk about that a lot in the work that we do at our staff meetings and stuff. Intellectual humility, just humility in general, I think humble pie is the best way to think about something.
Well, we can keep talking to ourselves, or we can try to get out of our bubbles. And if we're going to successfully get out of our bubbles, then we have to be mindful of the language we use and the way we address things. Because if we signal to people through our language that we're coming from a certain perspective that they're biased against, that's going to shut the door almost immediately.
Yeah, because people do have that taste bud reaction, that flash, instant, intuitive reaction based on those taste buds. And so if you can make sure that you don't trigger those taste buds against what you're saying, then there's room to then access their reasoning.
Well, and also I think that not only just, don't trigger someone else's negative taste bud, but also you don't try to walk into a conversation not also having your own preferences to taste.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Trying to say, I'm not going to spit something out that I don't think is good just because of the first ingredient.
And all of that is to not say at all that there's no place for provocation, right? I mean, you still want to be able to challenge another person, right?
Yeah. Debate.
Debate, but the point is to really begin to understand both where you're coming from and the fact that other people are probably not coming from the same place, right? That's really the big takeaway there, is not to create a safe space where, you're only saying things that are non-controversial, but to really be thoughtful about the way in which you approach these conversations and to actually start the conversations. I guess one of the lessons would be not to refrain entirely from sharing your opinion, but I guess just to be more thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
Maybe not to be a bomb thrower, but to just listen a little bit more than maybe we are in our one-upsmanship sort of culture of posting the most provocative thing on social media.
Yeah, recognize other people's point of view when you're challenging them.
Yeah. So I'm wondering what you think about this. It seems to me that maybe one of the more positive takeaways that we can take from Jonathan Haidt in particular is that we as people are moral beings, and that seems like a good thing to me. I'm pleased to recognize that most people care about morality. And
that's millions of years of evolution that existed for a reason, to bring us to a point where we can survive as individuals and as a species, right?
Yeah. And even thrive. What is it about being moral that helps us in society and that has maybe added to our longevity as human beings?
Well, I suppose all of us, 99.9% of us, have the moral taste bud that maybe murder is wrong.
Yes.
Right? And so at least we all can agree on that still.
I mean, people from all parties all over the world that care about children, they don't necessarily like to see animals abused. We all, as humanity, have these sticking points that are the same, and can we just build from there and find common ground?
And so it really does come down to the means, doesn't it? We all continue to have the same ends. I mean, more or less, right? We all want to see what's best for the poor and disadvantaged and everybody, everyone entirely, right? It just comes down to whether you're interested in having a policy that promotes fairness superficially or actually achieves fairness deeply.
But then that's interesting, because then even if you're appealing to someone's moral taste bud about that, maybe it makes it worse because you're saying that, okay, well, your system is actually results in more harm and less care. And precisely because they care so much about care versus harm, then they're triggered more by it, because how dare you think that I am on the wrong side of something that I care so deeply about?
And
I guess,
why would that person then go on to listen to the other person thinks? If they think that I'm immoral for having this position, then, well, I no longer care what you think.
Yeah.
Do you think that's happening?
I think so, yeah.
and so what's the key takeaway is that everyone should learn economics, right?
I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because, I mean, the people on this wall, I mean, that was the thing. I mean, like Mises and Bastiat, they didn't really care. They didn't, mostly they were really into the arguments, just into the logic of like, okay, your economics just makes no sense. And this is the economics that does make sense. And that's indispensable. So I think we shouldn't think that we're going to throw that out and only appeal to emotions and taste buds.
Was it Rothbard who said if socialists understand economics, they wouldn't be socialists anymore?
I don't remember if that was him. It sounds like something he'd say.
I would hope that would be the case.
Yeah.
My hope is also that we're not, as sort of individuals and as a species more widely, so wed to our own ideas and our own pride of authorship that we generally refuse to accept contradictory information.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me, especially you brought up people learning more about economics. Here's where I think I notice a lot of problems, is that all sides of this accuse the others of the same things. People on the right accuse people on the left of not understanding economics, but the left accuses the right of the same thing. It's just that people are approaching economics from different places. People who are more interested in government intervention, they can justify all the way to Tuesday why we should have this policy and what the numbers are going to look like, and here's a beautiful chart.
Right.
And it doesn't mean much to people on the other side because they interpret it completely differently.
I do think that on the left, it seems that intentions matter more as opposed to results. And so I think there is a little bit of a disparity between how much the left actually even considers economics.
That if I meant well, then it's good, rather than the outcomes I produced did good.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair point, Dan. I think that kind of where the buck stops is that people are forgetful. So if we advocated for one set of policies based on these kinds of economics, then, well, by the time we could see what the results were, we've already moved on to something else. And so there's not the accountability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we all want to be accountable, and I have to be accountable to our viewers' time. So I'm going to say that we should probably move on to that conversation in a later feedcast, and thank each of you for your awesome ideas and participation on this one. And we'll see everyone on the next feedcast. Have a great weekend, everybody.